Dr. Ian Baker, how are you?
I'm very well. Good to see you after last time in Bhutan.
Wow, Bhutan was a journey, a magical journey.
Good, good.
Yeah, so you are a student of yoga, you are a traveler, a philosopher, a writer, a historian. You're many, many things. It's really hard to put you in one box. And
I
I've
guess
heard
that's
of,
always been, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
the
I
first
prefer
time, the
living out of
first.
boxes, so that's maybe not a bad thing.
Yeah, the first time I've heard of you was I got a bit curious because I've been studying the yoga, Eastern yoga, specifically from the Indian subcontinent,
Hmm.
and I've been doing some practices in a bit of Kriya and Hatha, and I got curious about the other versions of yoga that is there in the subcontinent, and came across the Tibetan version of yoga,
Hmm.
and I with YouTube I found out six yogas of Naropa, a
Hmm.
video where you made a very precise and detailed explanation, like a summary of what the six yogas of Naropas are,
Hmm.
and that got me really, really interested and curious. And then I got your book. You have this amazing collection detailing, the history of Tibetan yoga with beautiful images. And yeah, that got me more and more curious. I was really drawn to this side of yoga, and then I came across your retreat, your
Hmm.
the Vajrapat retreat, and we were in Bhutan recently, and yeah,
Hmm.
that's how it all began. Um, yeah, so can you tell me about your journey? You started out, your early days. You got into, um, you got a fascination with mountains, nature, hiking, and
Hmm.
seeking. Just your curiosity for life was drawn you into different places, especially in Nepal and Tibet. So let's start
Hmm.
from there.
Yeah, I suppose that my journey into yoga and meditation was a direct result of my early interest and absorption and almost obsession with mountain climbing. And actually, my I was first drawn to the practice of meditation as a result of watching my mind as it in the vertical world of rock climbing. You know, when you're literally when one move is a in a certain sense an unconscious choice between life and death. When you're lead climbing, you know, any small error of judgment can lead to a potentially fatal fall. And so I was always fascinated by watching my mind as it moved through these vertical worlds, rock climbing, and recognizing that, you know, how fear, you know, sometimes a very understandable fear of fear of falling, could lead to this contraction of vision and sort of a loss of awareness, a loss of perception, actually. And so what I found through my initial practice of meditation, my first introduction to meditation with through my college roommate who'd studied transcendental meditation, you know, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi tradition. But I found that, and so I went through that process when I was still a teenager. But what I found through that was this stilling of the mind and how that carried over from the meditative state into everyday experience, including, in my case, rock climbing. So allowing this kind of calmness to kind of permeate my being when I was in otherwise, you could say, quite, you know, potentially hazardous circumstances. And then I moved on from the transcendental meditation, the TM, to Zen meditation. And that was for a variety of reasons, also because one of my professors in college was himself very engaged with the Zen tradition. And I actually was doing a course with him, and he'd built a Zendo, a Zen meditation space behind his home. So I was able to go there and practice with him, and also attend a traditional Zen sesshin, which is the kind of prolonged meditation immersion in the Zen tradition. And through that had some very profound experiences that actually completely transformed my climbing. So interestingly, watching my mind in the vertical world was like a direct indication of what was happening through this process of refining, as I experienced it, consciousness through these yogic techniques and meditative techniques. So that was really, it brought me into meditation, but then I became fascinated, of course, by meditation in its own right, because of not just in that it actually very directly enhanced my mountaineering experience, but it actually had these profound experiences that were, engaging my sense of being in a way that I hadn't actually experienced before. And so that led to my going to Nepal when I was still an undergraduate student and wanting to engage more deeply with these meditative practices. And I met my main teacher then, this Chatro Sengye Dorji, who passed away only a few years ago at the age of 102. But that was really my journey. And it opened, and I was particularly drawn to him as a teacher because of having been told, that he'd spent a lot of time, years and years, in high mountain retreats and caves and in the wilderness. So that really appealed to me because it, again, sort of spoke to my having come to Buddhism through my deep interest in mountaineering and wilderness and high mountain environments. So that led, to a long, prolonged kind of apprenticeship, if you will, where he would send me off to caves in the mountains and tell me to come back in a month or in 6 weeks and ask me what I experienced. And so that led, and through my experience, that became the guiding principle to how he taught me. It wasn't like following a program book, but actually my experiences are what then guided him in guiding me. And so it was I felt very grateful for that, because I think, all of the earliest traditions of Indian and Tibetan yoga were that way, where they were very individualized practices that speak to our own actual condition rather than to some kind of, prescriptive, institutionalized form. At least that was certainly how I was fortunate to be engaged in the tradition through that. And I think he was amused by my, every time he would want to send me off to, the farther away the cave was or the more difficult the place was, the more enthusiastic I became about it. So that I felt very, very grateful for. But yeah, that was my introduction to into the world of Tibetan Buddhism. But also one of the other aspects of my teacher that I really appreciated was that he and his teacher, Dujum Jigdro Yeshe Dorji Rinpoche, who was actually the one who I took refuge with as per the Buddhist tradition, both of them had actually studied and learned from Shaiva yogis, particularly Ramnath Agori, an Agori yogi. So they were very interested in these core practices that are shared, you could say, between the Shaiva traditions and the Tantric Buddhist traditions. And so that's really where I felt the essence of what I was interested in, which was really the Tantric yogas and how they have a kind of common ground between the Buddhist tradition and the Shaiva tradition in these more, you could say, subtle body yogic practices, such as you cited, the 6 yogas of Naropa, as being probably the most well-known within the Tantric Buddhist tradition.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I was reading your book, fascinating book, where you detail accounts of your journey, Heart of the World.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I remember, like you were saying, there was a time where you were caught up between um, the pursuit of, being the experience being intellectual,
Mm-hmm.
or being more having a more bodily experience of the tradition, of the teachers, of the practices. So I remember you at one point you were in you back to Colombia, you got a scholarship, and then I think one of the last final lectures, you decided that, okay, no, I'm going to take a little break, and going to
Yeah.
go back to Nepal. And one of the things that pulled you was the concept or the idea of Bayul,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm saying that right.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
please tell us a bit more about um, this sacred hidden lands are supposed to, give the
Mm-hmm.
practitioner heighten their experience and fasten their experience to in their
Mm.
journey.
Sure. Yeah, as you say, that was really the hook, in a certain sense, my back door into the tradition of high mountain retreats, which is a tradition in Tibetan Buddhism, with the idea that the elements of nature, and particularly in powerful, potent places, um, can be catalysts for our own practice and accelerate our meditative and yogic experience on the path. And so when I first went to Nepal, I went there, I mean, to go there, I went on a college semester abroad program from my undergraduate college, university, Middlebury College in Vermont. But in order to do that, I had to do a project that would be within my stated major at that time, which at the time was studio art. So I thought, okay, I'll study traditional Tibetan Thangka painting, scroll painting, and so I applied to for that as my project. And so in the month that I had to focus on that during that college semester back in 1977, uh, I studied with a traditional painter up in the Solukhumbu region near Everest in Nepal. And as your audience may know, the traditional Tibetan Thangka painting is very prescriptive. The deities have very set forms, and they have to be particular proportions. They have to have particular number of arms, the implements in their hands, etc., 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 are very prescriptive. But the scenes that surround them, the nature is not prescriptive, and there's more creativity involved with that. So I was very fascinated, because of my interest in the mountains, in what potential symbolism there was in the mountains, the waterfalls, the very unusual and sometimes sort of exaggerated landscapes that were shown as the context and complement to these peaceful, wrathful, and ecstatic tantric deities. So when I spoke to my Thangka painting teacher about that, he, gave wonderful descriptions of what the symbolism was of the melting of the glaciers, the melting of compassion, and that there was actually a kind of analog within the landscape of subtle body physiology. And I found that particularly fascinating. For example, he pointed out in one of the paintings he'd done how the waterfall was a symbol of the central channel, the Shushumna. And then the glaciers at the top of the mountain were actually the melting of the white element. And then it goes down to this, this sort of sea below, and this whole idea of the natural cycles of nature that we see in the external world meteorologically are reflected in our own internal meteorology, if you will, of the subtle body system. And so that was fascinating to realize, the coded symbolism that's less explicitly or at least certainly in his case, it was explicit to himself, but it isn't something that's widely reflected upon or written about or known. What traditional artists how they may understand the landscapes that they're representing. But in that context, I saw it all as being very imaginative. And then there was one particular painting that was, really magical. It sort of showed this like hidden world. in the side of the Thangka painting. And I said, well, these places, I guess they're only in the mind. And he goes, no, they're not just in the mind. They're also there, hidden in remote parts of the Himalayas, but they're very difficult to reach. They're hidden behind, these mountains, and pointing out across the valley to this peak of Amadablam, which is just to the southwest of Mount Everest, which is the area that I was in. So then I became really hooked because, I was 19 at the time. I'd come to Nepal, with this background in climbing, and to be told about these paradisical places that you could only reach with great difficulty by climbing over mountain walls was, really exactly the kind of thing I wanted to hear. So that sort of set up a fascination with this idea of the Beyu, the hidden lands. So then I went to Chatra Rinpoche, who was my Buddhist teacher, and asked him about these places. And he actually wrote, and it's unfortunately a document which I lost, because he did it in beautiful calligraphy. He wrote down the names of these hidden lands, and said, yeah, you should try to go to them. And so that set up this kind of and then with each one of those being a place where particular kinds of practices were particularly potent or powerful. So that led to years of going off to these hidden lands, and in particular one called Beyu Pemaku, this hidden land arrayed like a lotus, which is in the southeast corner of Tibet, and held to be, there's so much. That's the book that you mentioned, Heart of the World, is about this. It's about hidden lands and Beyu generally, but in specific, it's about these multiple expeditions that I took to Beyu Pemaku, the hidden land arrayed like a lotus is, and how practice becomes inseparable from one's journey through the hidden land in its inner secret and so-called innermost secret, or yangsang, is the Tibetan word, is dimensions. And that just, became a absorptive journey to kind of understand nature, one's own nature, as well as the external nature on these sort of increasingly subtle levels, and how those levels interact, and how we experience that through our meditative experiences, through our dreams, through our somatic experience and subtle intuition, and opening up new dimensions, as it were, in landscape, but those doors and understandings opening up simultaneously with those openings that occur within one's own subtle physiology, if you will, but a kind of psychoanatomy, because all of these subtle body yogas, of course, in both the Shaiva and the Buddhist tradition, working with this idea of embodied consciousness, mapped, as we understand it, through these intangible flows of energy, the Nadi Prana Bindu, or the Tsalung Tigli, as it's called in the Tibetan tradition. So the Beyu, just kind of to summarize that, were fascinating on an outer level as sort of sanctuaries that were remote from the kind of the world as we commonly experience it, and then the inner level as places that could only be experienced as the mind came into sort of sympathetic resonance with those dimensions of the external landscape. And then on a so-called secret level, as it would be called in the Tibetan tradition, where there's this non-dual nature between the elements of our own psychosomatic constitution and the external nature. So the earth, water, fire, and air all having kind of, we come into that kind of resonance with, and then that creates this non-dual experience in which the external world no longer appears external, but is really, in that sense, inseparable from one's own consciousness. And that can lead, as when one practices in such places, to really heightened states of awareness that, even as the tradition says, it's the thin line between perception and imagination on the one hand, but a lot of it's the whole idea of breaking down of these kind of categories that we normally use to navigate in the world at large. But suddenly, through these practices, as you know, you begin to navigate a subtler level of reality, in which the external and the internal are ultimately just arbitrary or provisional divisions.
Wonderful. Wow. So in essence, it's one, the element of Bayul is one pathway that is sort of peeling off the layers of separation between us, between the internal and the external. And I remember, like, while reading the book, the journey wasn't that easy. You had to go through a lot of difficulties. You know, there are a lot of impediments on the way, in terms of natural impediments and in terms of, you know, physical impediments and other people, and, you know, people, especially your guides. You had to convince them, you know, to go to certain places, because they thought a certain cliff or certain gorge was very dangerous, and, you know, there are stories of people in the past not making it back, and a lot of danger ahead in the path. So the idea of struggle in nature and the idea of struggle within to reach a certain destination, I find that fascinating, to sort of coming back to the point of underneath the struggle, underneath the pain, is where you find your gift or the beauty or your purpose.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, because you know, so often in life, people are seeking pleasure, they're seeking comfort zones, we're seeking, you know, even in the prescriptive prayers of religious traditions, it's about avoiding suffering, and even Buddhism has that as its primary motivation on the surface, is to escape from the torments of sorrow and suffering. But on a subtler level, I think on the tantric level, which in a way where we take what's sort of on the surface, we reverse some of the logic of that, because we recognize that it's in, and I guess for me that was something I really learned through rock climbing, because it's the opposite of a comfort zone. You know, you're actually you're trying to disrupt your sense of comfort, disrupt your sense of safety, disrupt your sense of all the things that we normally would think that we are desirable in life. And then you're finding that there's that we expand when we challenge ourselves on that level. And that's why I was always attracted to Tantric Buddhism, as opposed to, you could say, the earlier forms, the Sravakayana, the more renunciatory forms of Buddhism, which were, you know, saw life as constant struggle and strife and suffering, and that really proscribed a kind of monastic disengagement from these struggles in life, or what we would call samsara, this sort of endless cycle of discontent that arises by not achieving what we want to achieve in life. But it's really the struggle that, in a certain sense, as you said, often provides the gift. And if we're just trying to avoid suffering, then, you know, we're not going to probably grow and expand or become even as empathic as we might if we actually can engage with it skillfully. And I think that is, you know, again, going to the Buddhist tradition, what the bodhisattva ideal is about, because that's really about staying within the world of suffering and not trying to escape it just out of personal desire for, you know, some kind of individual salvation, but actually recognizing that, you know, we're all interconnected, and that, you know, we have to sort of stay in the game for all beings, and that, you know, there is no ultimate personal contentment that can be achieved outside of working for the benefit of all beings, which of course is the fundamental view of the Mahayana, or greater vehicle Buddhism. So, and that, you know, it includes the active engagement with struggle and you could say productive challenges. And I think that's an important view to take into account, because I think too often, you know, suffering is pathologized and just seen as something to avoid. But I think if we can work with it skillfully, it can be something that generates a not just empathy, but expanded capacities and skillful responsiveness to life in all of its different aspects.
Yeah. I like the words you use, skillful engagement.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking about suffering, there was a part in your book where you mentioned you had a point in your life was a bit low. I think it was during a time where you had met with an accident. I believe it was in Norway.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then you were injured. You couldn't do much, and you were obviously you had a lot of mental talk and inner talk, and that led to some part of your life that I would say is a low point that many of us come across. Would you mind talking about that and what made you sort of overcome that?
Yeah. No, that's it was I had just graduated from college. I was 22. I was sort of at, the whole world was before me. I mean, climbing and in every aspect of my life I felt was just beginning. And I was teaching, a summer job that year was teaching rock climbing at a climbing school in Norway. And I went up with one of the instructors after it was during the summer, so it never got dark at that time in northern Norway. It was up near the Arctic Circle, so basically midnight sun. So we went up to do this very, very difficult climb called Satan, interestingly. And so I was leading one of the pitches, and suddenly I fell. I have no recollection of it because there's several days which are still a complete blackout for me. But I remember very distinctly, climbing up along this rock face that was very difficult to protect. In technical climbing terms, that means there were very few cracks that could be used to put in so-called protection to lead one's rope through in the case of a fall. So I remember doing a long lead out, meaning up a face that had small holes but didn't have any cracks in order to protect myself in case of a fall. And somehow or other, I fell. And I was up high above an overhang, so my climbing partner couldn't see what happened when I fell, but I came down with a volley of rocks, so we don't know whether those rocks fell from above and caused me to fall, or whether I dislodged rocks through an inopportune handhold or something like that. We don't know. But in any case, the next thing I knew, I was in a hospital on a small island off the coast of Norway, complete, with broken bones and fractured skull and everything, and had no idea, what had happened because I didn't have any recollection of the fall, just of the moment before the fall only. But to make a long story short, it was like going from, as one would think, in an optimal physical, mental state of just graduating from college with the world in front of me, and this grant from the Explorers Club to go back to the Himalayas and study the links between shamanism and Tantra. I mean, it was an extremely exciting time in my life, and suddenly I was sort of cast down, and that's why I always found the name of this climb being Satan was kind of amusing, because it was sort of like falling from grace. It was a very long time, before I was able to, I not only had the physical challenges of walking, I had skull fractures that went through my inner ear. Therefore, I had, my hardly any balance for a long period until that stabilized, and really quite severe depression, because I reached I was at a state where everything I had planned in life suddenly was in question, whether I'd be able to do the things I wanted to do. and whether, and I really had this feeling that if I wasn't going to heal completely and get back to a state that I'd been in, I was really not sure I wanted kind of to stick around, as it were. And so that was a rather extremist position that I took, but it led to, on the one hand, it was a struggle. I then went through every possible healing modality that I had no prior knowledge of alternative healing methods, et cetera, but I decided I would try everything that I could find to see, if it would actually be that which would turn around and catalyze a healing process that was being very elusive at that time. But anyway, as you probably read in the book, all of that was very elusive, and I was really at a period a year later where, did I really want to stay in this dimension? With the, I couldn't climb the way I could climb. There were many things that I felt were impaired, and I wasn't sure were going to improve sufficiently to my satisfaction, at least. And yeah, without going into the entire story of it, there was a waterfall in the Green Mountains, not on any trail, that had become sort of infamous because a professor at the graduate school that I was then at had died there the year before, and it was a very deceptive waterfall in the sense that there were these hydraulics supposedly that just drew you down, and he drowned along with other people who had drowned there. And so anyway, I was fascinated by the idea of this powerful vortex in the middle of the mountains that where people had drowned, and where that would seemingly look so benign. So I decided I would find this waterfall. And when I did find it, and I mention all this because it was a real turning point in my life. It's exactly as it was said it would look. It would look completely benign. It looked impossible to think that this would be water that one would enter and be drawn down into. But in any case, as I said, I was in this sort of ambivalent state about life and death, and I took off all my clothes and I jumped into the waterfall from above. It was quite a drop down, and it's immediately was sucked down into this vortex, and I realized I'd made this kind of momentary decision that felt like it was going to have an ultimate consequence. And I remember so distinctly my fingers unable to gain any purchase on these smooth walls at the side of the waterfall. And so it was, and I just had this flash that, my whole pursuit of extreme nature, and nearly dying from rock climbing, and suddenly here I was, this looked like it was going to be the end. And I just remember getting then suddenly churned down into the waterfall. And anyway, it was like a whole life passed before my eyes at that point. But what I did remember from high school, when I had done whitewater kayaking, was that if you ever did get caught in a hydraulic, and this was similar to one, that the last thing you want to do is fight to get to the surface. You want to go down to the bottom, and then you can get kicked out of the hydraulic. So that's after totally being churned and pummeled against the rocks at the bottom of the waterfall. I kind of recalled that, and then I tried, just as I was losing any ability to hold my breath further, and I kind of blacked out, so I don't remember exactly what happened, but I tried to go down to the bottom and kind of grab onto these rocks at the bottom of the waterfall. And then I blocked out, and the next thing I remember was kind of lying naked on this flat rock down river, and I'd been churned out. And I remember just looking up at the leaves of the trees above me in this sort of blue sky, and it was an amazing experience of kind of, on one hand, rebirth, but a second chance. And it was a real turning point for me, because suddenly, I'd survived something that I had didn't think I was going to survive at all. But in opposite from the climbing accident, where it all happened suddenly, without my foreknowledge, this was something that, in a certain sense, I had premeditated, and in surviving it, gained this enormous appreciation for life, and felt like everything. And I remember the walk back up out of the bushwhacking up out of the mountains was just like kind of coming back into life and realizing how precious and extraordinary life is. And the whole healing process began from there, actually. So, yeah, since you asked about it, that was where, again, a struggle and adversity ended up being the catalyst for, probably the most profound experience of my life, to recognize that, it's through adversity, through difficulty, through danger, and putting our lives in danger, that the preciousness of life can become so augmented in a way. And that led just to, very profound shifts for me at that point. Going through sort of the ultimate fear of losing life, and then at that point everything was just, it was like floating through life for a while after that. What was there to fear? What was there to be anxious about? What was there, I felt like I'd sort of confronted the abyss and come back, and it had a very profound and lasting effect that way. And it's not something, one would ever, even as profound as it was, it's not something that one would ever wish on anybody else. But I think it's something that people who have survived extreme adversities often report, where you do come back with a sense of having, a sense of grace almost, as it were, where you can enter the fray, but without feeling that you're impinged by it. Everything is, there's a whole nother way that one can approach life and existence. And I think that's very much related to what, we experience, going back to, how you framed our conversation with yoga and meditation. It's what we experience there, but without the, there's, rather than the physical death, there's the ego death. And in the release and letting go of that egoic identity, we enter into a larger sense of being that can take us into places that are otherwise closed. So I think this is, again, where, these kinds of radical yogic practices, sometimes they can be radical, can bring us into states of being that are often otherwise not commonly experienced in life.
Thank you for sharing.
Mm.
Yeah, wow. It's for me, this story feels like that was your ultimate initiation into life itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It definitely was an initiation, or and an empowerment, as it were, into through direct experience, unmediated by any kind of institution or tradition. It was nature, and nature can be uncompromising, and the confrontation, with death like that, as you said, is the ultimate initiation.
And you mentioned you did try out different modalities, different healing modalities, and specifically based on one of our conversations we had, you did some research, or also maybe got into the teachings deeply of the name doesn't come to me, a somatic tradition somewhere in West Bengal. And can you briefly describe it? Because, soma is a plant you'd find in the Vedas that would sort of give you heightened experiences of enlightenment and bliss, and
Mm-hmm.
different other teachings from the masters.
Mm-hmm.
And from then on, there has been different myths of what Soma is. But
Mm-hmm.
you are actually in contact with a tradition, with teachers who believe that they know what the content are, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah, yeah.
passed on from
Yeah.
the ancient tradition. So please, I would
Mm-hmm.
love to
Sure.
hear about that.
Yeah, I guess as a result of that healing and learning, you could say, about alternative healing methods and substances, I became very interested in potent substances that can bring about that kind of catalyzing, either whether they catalyze healing, whether they catalyze a kind of shift in consciousness and awareness. And as you said, in the earliest known scriptures, the Rig Veda, has these elaborate hymns to Soma, which is both a plant medicine as well as a god Soma. And it's for hundreds of years, it's been a mystery as to what, and a lot of speculation by scholars and researchers on the nature of Soma and what its psychoactive components might be, and whether it was a single plant, whether it was a combination of plants. So there was a lot of mystery about Soma, but I was very fortunate about 5 years ago to be traveling to Tarapit, which is a Shakti Pita from the Shaiva Shakta tradition. And I went there to meet
What's a Shakti Pita?
Oh, sorry, a Shakti Pita is a place that literally, so we have Shiva, in the Tantric Hindu tradition, we have Shiva and Shakti. So on an esoteric level, Shiva literally means pure consciousness, pure awareness, and Shakti is that sort of animating life principle that brings, so Shiva and Shakti are on a external, superficial, mythological level seen as god and goddess, but on a deeper level, they are the male-female polarity that brings life into existence. And in that context, Shiva represents pure awareness, pure consciousness in the esoteric Hindu tantric traditions, and Shakti is the kind of this animating principle of nature that brings life, and it's, one without the other is incomplete. So Shakti Pitas, as they're called in the tantric tradition, are Pita. It means a seat of power, or seat of the goddess. So these are places where this Shakti, this kind of primordial energy, this primordial power associated with the Devi, with the female, with different emanations, if it were, of Shakti, are considered to be particularly potent. And there's a whole mythology about them, about the different 51 Shakti Pitas associated with different body parts of the goddess Sati as parts of her body fell to earth. Complicated ones, but in any case, the Tarapit is a place that's considered to be the most powerful site for the goddess Tara, who is revered both in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions. And in any case, I was working at that time for the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for a planned exhibition that I was going to be co-curator for on the art of Tantric Buddhism. And in that context, I was with the curator from the Victoria and Albert Museum, who I was going to be doing the exhibition with, and John Clark, and we traveled because we both had this fascination of looking at the common roots of Tantric Buddhism and Tantric Shaivism, Tantric Hinduism. And in that context, we went to this power place of Tarapit, because it's also recognized within that tradition that the goddess Tara was of Buddhist origins. And so we were very interested in how these two traditions kind of came together at this particular place. So we were going to look at ways in which, we could include that narrative into the exhibition. So in that context, I met a teacher named Tirthanath, who was from the Kaula tradition. The Kaula is a tantric tradition of you could say Shaktiism, which is their Shaivism, which is worshipping of Shiva, and then Shakti tradition is one that sort of more emphasizes the power and potency of the goddess, of the female form. So this was Tarapita as a particularly a form of Shakti. So in any case, in the Kaula tradition, it's also called the Yogini Kaula. There are 10 forms of the goddess, the Das Mahavidya, one of which is Tara. And I went to meet him because I'd been initiated in the Kaula tradition, but in a different Shakti Pita, one in Assam called Kamakya. But I wanted to see, what, and I was told about this teacher here called, Swami Tirthanath. And so meeting him, somehow or other, we got to the subject of entheogens as supports for these noetic visionary experiences that arise in the Kaula tradition in particular. And that led to his revelation of a living tradition of Soma within their lineage of the Kaula, the Yogini Kaula, that included 64 different ingredients, some of which were psychoactive, some of which were kind of synergetic, but not specifically psychoactive. But the combination of them were a very, very potent formula that they used within their rituals and in their practice in conjunction with breathing practices and meditation practices and mantra practices in order to be able to encounter this blue tide, this blue wave connected with the blue-throated form of Tara as she emerges out of this kind of primordial ocean. I mean, it's a beautiful mythology around it. And then what you recognize in his description was that as you using the breath and the mind and the body to navigate very, very challenging existential states brought on by, in the case of this formula of Soma, high levels of Datura. Datura being a very, very potent psychoactive plant. And so I was very fortunate to be able to spend time there, to be able to note from him, many, I didn't get all of them, but the primary ingredients of this formula and the ways in which it was used. And actually my article on that has just come out in a book published by MIT Press, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. It just came out this month. It's called Expanding Mindscapes, A Global History of Psychedelics. So my chapter it's called Nectar of the Blue Goddess, and it's on a living Soma cult in West Bengal, India. And it's as I said, the lead chapter on that because Soma being the first known sort of psychedelic, and also one that had been a great source of mystery, continues to be a source of mystery. But what's clearly evident from the research that I did is that, it actually has a formula that was carried down in this tradition of the Yogini Kaula. So that goes into great detail about the ways in which potent substances, entheogenic substances in this case, because it literally is an entheogen in the sense that it's producing a vision of a deity, in this case the blue-throated form of the goddess Tara, who is a salvific figure, and as the sadhika, the person practicing and taking the Soma, and then the deity appears in a way that then kind of frees you from what could be a very, very bad trip, literally, because one's encounter, Datura is a very, very potent psychoactive substance that outside of any kind of ritual context can be deeply disorienting at best. So again, I think, your question is very pertinent because it's, again, how do we find where, we wouldn't do it for comfort or for conventional forms of happiness. We're seeking to challenge and disrupt our sense of safety and familiarity in order to be able to expand, as the title of this new just published book is, about expanding the mind, expanding the scope of the mind. and the landscapes of consciousness. So in that sense, soma, other potent substances that have been used both in the Buddhist and the Tantric Hindu tradition are, used very much in that way, as are some of the breathing practices and meditative practices that again disrupt any sense of conventional sense of identity, or that may be in some cases limiting us or limiting our potential.
And it's interesting how entheogens have been used for thousands and thousands of years in different cultures to access certain altered states where healing and recognition and realization and of the self, of the psyche, of your environment, of your relationship to nature, and all these different elements that we tend to forget happen. So yeah, and I'm really interested in, like, for me one of the big fascinations is like who, what, how were these things placed in this planet for this, for humanity. And so it's even in I think going through your book, there was a short description where a certain Lama, I forget his name, described, maybe it was from his visions of certain plants that are present in the Bayul that could give you, I believe 5 or 6 plants that could give you these states.
Yep.
And I wanted to ask, have you, or do you know anyone who might have had, consumed or had access to these plants in the Himalayas? Do you have any stories like that? It'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, so as you say, the Bayu that we talked about before, these hidden lands they're not just an oral tradition, but they're a really ancient textual tradition. So there are many texts that are attributed to Padmasambhava, who was an 8th century figure who established Tantric Buddhism in Tibet, and also so there are many meditation and ritual texts associated with Padmasambhava, mostly as hidden treasure texts. But those treasure texts also include these guidebooks, as they were, as in a sense, to the hidden lands, to the Bayu. And there's one in particular, which is a guidebook to 5 siddhi, producing plants in Bayu Pemekö in particular. And these are plants that are described with extraordinary powers, one of, to remember past lives, to reverse the aging process, to be able to travel, as it were, through magical flight to different Buddha realms, to heal intractable diseases, really, extraordinary magical plants. So, of course, when coming across those texts and descriptions of those plants in Pemekö, that became something of enormous interest to me. And one of the trips that's narrated in the Heart of the World, it's called The Mountain, was traveling with Kawatuku, who was a Tibetan Lama from eastern Bhutan, eastern Tibet, from Kham, who was specifically on that mission to find and identify these 5 magical plants. And so with him, we tried many plants that he thought were potential candidates, but we didn't find any that specifically had the kind of effects that we were looking for. Interestingly, however, there was psilocybin growing in those same areas, but that was not, from the text at least, it doesn't seem that any of even though the descriptions themselves are quite fanciful, none of them seem to be fungi, and yet coincidentally there were psychoactive fungi in the area. So we did try those, and those were for sure potent, and it's just that there wasn't a textual tradition to account for them. But Kawatuku himself, when we left him, he went into retreat thinking that those mushrooms would help him to find the other five magical plants. So that was interesting in its own right to see that there may be some latitude in what these five plants might be. In any case, after finishing The Heart of the World, I went back to Pamuk 3 additional times in its more southern reaches, where both there's a denser tribal population, it's more tropical, and where some of these magical plants are particularly said to be locatable. And the one called Sakundu Zampo, meaning the all beneficent herb plant, we identified that on a particular mountain, Pemasheri, that where it is described as growing in the text. And again, we were cautious in trying it because, again, we had no idea what the results of that would be. But the seeds, interestingly, the Tibetan traditional doctor, plant collector Amchi that I went with, he's used some of those seeds from those plants that we collected then in long life formulas that he believes have this slight psychoactive property, but we don't know. And it may just simply be that the dosage isn't, and then unfortunately, we weren't able to collect large enough samples to be able to see what ingesting this in a larger amount might lead to, nor were we able to collect enough to be able to do other kind of analysis to see what potentially psychoactive alkaloids might be within the plant. So that sort of remains to be, it's an unconcluded research project that I'm very interested in getting back to, along with the Soma, because what we're looking at here is, the so-called treasure text tradition of Tantric Buddhism, very specifically making reference to psychoactive herbs that will bring about the kinds of siddhi, or enhanced or extraordinary sort of somatic powers, the siddhi, that otherwise are said to take lifetime of practice to achieve. And so even as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, when I actually had a conversation with him about these plants, and I said, what do you think about that? And he goes, well, if there's a plant that can bring about the results that we can get from meditation, but do it faster, no problem. So it was a very interesting idea that he said that there's no merit, as it were, just in thinking that we have to take the long route, that which is the whole view of Tantric Buddhism anyway. It's the shortcut, the short path, the direct path. But even His Holiness, when I very specifically talked to him about these substances, he didn't have any theoretical objection to the possibility that these. And we talked in that context about certain forms of Tibetan longevity medicines, the so-called precious pills, which are controversial because of their high content of mercury. And mercury in the Tibetan medical tradition is held to be both the greatest poison and also the greatest medicine. And so that can also be applied to the meditative practices that talk about the five mental poisons, and how these exaggerated states, afflictive states of consciousness, often associated with this, with overpowering emotions, etc., can also be the key, to freeing ourselves from unconscious patterning in the mind, in the same way that entheogens are held to do across traditions. By encountering the shadow, as it were, in a Jungian sense, we free ourselves from its unconscious machinations. And so, again, as Jung said, its enlightenment does not necessarily consist just in imagining figures of light, but in making the darkness conscious. And I think that entheogens are specifically that which can bring light into the depths of the unconscious psyche, and bring about liberation from those unconscious forms of patterning that sometimes can limit and contract our lives.
Yeah, and I see I see these tools, these entheogenic tools, placed in places where, say, yoga has not reached, especially in the South American continents. Perhaps they have their own yogic practices that I might not be aware of. Different connection to the sun, the moon, the planets, different movements, but specifically, these plants, like you could say, ayahuasca or peyote or San Pedro, whatnot, they grow in these regions where, historically they have been revered and, used ritualistically as the tools for transformation. And, on the eastern part, in Asia, where we have, yoga and meditation as the most encouraged tool to sort of access higher states or union with the source. It's quite fascinating. You have books have been written trying to separate them out. Books have been written making the interconnectedness between the Buddhism or entheogens, etc. So yeah, it's I find it fascinating. It always opens up our curiosity of life, because we have given how life is right now for an individual. Having a 9-to-5 job, wrapped up in desires that are not in our control, giving into our reptilian calls in nature and things like that. We only have a limited sense of perception of reality, and and then when we encounter meditation or dreams, or sometimes a teacher that awakens something deeper within us, changes, gives us a different perspective where we are curious more, not only about money and living and family and this and that, but who are we? What is our purpose? What's happened? What is death? Things like that. Yeah.
No, very, very, very much. And I think you pointed out something I think very important is that, a lot of teachers in the Indian subcontinent will talk about, the real soma is not some lost plant formula, but it's actually that which is released from our own brain, whether it's the pineal gland or wherever it might be. It's the nectar, this nectar of immortality, the Amrita, which is the synonym, in a sense, for Soma in the Rig Veda. That's brought about through yogic disciplines and practices, so that actually, and then also, as I've heard some teachers say, well, it can be that certain plant substances might help to release that Soma in our brains. And so, in a certain sense, there's a relationship between an outer Soma and an inner Soma, but the inner Soma being that which can be brought into, activated through yogic practices that, as you say, have been particularly developed in the Indian subcontinent and Tibet. So it's not always having to look for that plant formula, which is the way that it's been often emphasized in South America and to some degree in North America with peyote, but ayahuasca, all of those being highly ritualized uses of very powerful plant medicines to bring about internal shifts of consciousness and transformations of consciousness, which one again could arguably say are producing it's all biochemical in the end. Even our states of consciousness have biochemical analogs, even in the kind of neuroendocrinal secretions and substances that are released, when ayahuasca, when serotonin's increased, or dopamine, or whatever, and the stages of those in static, meaning arising from within states of bliss. I think there's a relationship between supportive substances and supportive practices.
And yeah, I would like to quickly also delve into a really fascinating a topic that fascinates me. And we had a little conversation back in Bhutan. It delves into the realms of the supernatural.
Hmm.
Uh, and I want you to repeat, or like a story you slightly mentioned about this creature that does not, if you're comfortable sharing it on screen, that
Right.
does not, you can't,
Yeah.
they don't reflect in the mirror. I forget
Yeah.
their name. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The
How did you
Banjankri.
encounter them? Banjankri.
Yeah, the Banjankri was I one of the positions I had while in in Nepal. I was technically a associate of the Foundation for Shamanic Studies under Michael Harner, who was a professor of anthropology at the New School for Social Research, but also became a good friend. And in the context of conversations we had, I had spoken to him about. Actually, it was early on that I heard about the so-called Banjankri. So Jankri is a Nepalese word for shaman, for someone who has that capacity to move between worlds, and Ban referring to forest, to jungle. So these are, and then the Banjankri just ended up referring to basically not a non-human. Um, Wait, it's very, very hard. They have the capacity to become invisible, to take on. But they're tiny. They can be tiny little entities. Probably this very strange. They have many, many different qualities associated with them. So I became quite fascinated by the widespread belief in the Banjankri and the powers that attributed to them. And so I kind of put out through different contacts I had in Nepal to see, and it's also in particular because even just the bones of a Banjankri, if you were fortunate enough to have one, had sort of magical powers. First of all, you could test them because the bone of a Banjankri would not reflect in a mirror, was one thing. So I said, well, okay, that's pretty easy to test. Um, so I had many strange encounters with the Banjankri thing. And then also sometimes I had strange conversations with people who claimed to have one in captivity that they kept in a kind of a gunny sack. I mean, it was a size of it was like 1 foot tall. Why it couldn't get out when it could, I mean, very strange conversations with seeming, uh, yeah. And then how you actually keep a Banjankri, in your sphere. I mean, there were different magical techniques for that. But in any case, probably what was most interesting was in one case I was going to be shown a Banjankri bone rather than a living Banjankri. So I said, okay, I'm going to bring my own mirror. So I brought a mirror that I'd gotten in the market, so big, that you would buy in any Kathmandu marketplace, and went to and the whole meeting was to be set up in some sort of small little guest house room somewhere. And we went there, and I brought out my mirror, and they get very nervous about these things because these things are, again, attributed with all kinds of powers that can go awry if things get out of hand. But in any case, this encounter, I brought out my mirror, and they brought out the bone, and my whole mirror went smoky dark. It made no sense at all, and it was after that that the Banjankri quest became not just one of intellectual kind of curiosity or anthropological curiosity, but it was like, what? How can that be? And we tested it several times, and then the whole in the mirror, which I took home, was perfectly normal under other circumstances. But as soon as bone was put in front of it, for unaccountable reason, it went totally smoky, and not black, but totally smoky, and it just didn't make sense. But in any case, in this ongoing quest, and I had a Nepali man who was helping me with this, with because I said, look, this is really going to change the scientific world if we can actually bring evidence that there's something that defies the laws of nature. So in any case, then another time when he arranged a meeting, again in a small little guest house, they brought out a whole hand, very small, like a little hand. It was like the size of a little monkey's hand, kind of dried, but with little bits of hair on it. And this is a Banjankri hand, and it was again supposed to. Oh, the other quality that the bones have is that they cast a reverse shadow, so the shadow will move towards the light as opposed to away from the light. So again, things that are easily testable. So in this case, I brought my mirror, and there was a light source. I had a flashlight as well, but this was in a certain sense, the end of my quest, because it was such a strange experience. I put out my hand, and they were going to give me to test this Banjankri hand, and it was like electric in my hand, and I dropped it from my hand after a moment of just looking at it, and it went down onto the floor of the hotel room. And it started scrambling all over the floor, and it was something out of a horror movie. And the man who had it, he was like desperately trying to, on the floor, trying to like grab it, and then muttering mantras. And then my friend, he said, "We got to get out of here." It was just again an unconclusive experience, because we sat in the other room for some time, and then he was in. I mean, to this day, I have no idea really what happened, but my friend sort of freaked out because he saw what happened. And it was just this feeling that he had of just being way over our heads, that this is not something, that one wanted to dabble with. And I kind of had the same feeling at that point. I mean, my intellectual curiosity was such that, and at the same time, I wanted to go back. But then he'd left town. Anyways, it just didn't work out. But for me, it was an encounter with something, as you said, sort of supernatural, in the sense of still natural, but going beyond what our common sense of naturalistic phenomena is. And I have no idea. I don't see any way that this was something where there was some battery put into this bone. It was a small kind of bone. But anyway, it scrambled all over the floor of the room. And then again, with having seen one before where it made the mirror go smoky, I wasn't able to do a conclusive test to see about the reverse shadow. But again, they were attributed, if you had one in your possession, you could do all kinds of other things with them too. They could open locks, they could open doors, they were definitely meant to have magical power. So anyway, that was just something that years ago I was fascinated by and tried to pursue, along with another phenomena like that called the Nagmani, which are these jewels in the heads of certain king cobras that again have special powers and attributes. So I was kind of just very interested in, you could say, this borderline between naturalistic and so-called supernatural phenomena, and how belief mediates between an expectation, alters the way naturalistic phenomena can appear. But I think that was my interest. But then what I experienced in all of these things was just something that made no sense, because I wasn't coming at these things with any great faith that they were real. I was just interested in just what people thought about them and what they were. But in the process of that, encountering things that just were way beyond naturalistic phenomena. And Nepal, in a certain sense, has a lot of that. So that was the Banjankri bones. It was the Nagmanis, these jewels in the heads of certain king cobras, nagas, and then also the Kichakani, which is a certain class of female ghost that I won't go into that story, but it's that's something I still, anytime I have wonder about the survival of consciousness after death, which I have theoretical doubts about, I still have to account for encounters I had with these phenomena called Kichakani in Nepal.
Kichikani.
So that's still something. Kichakani, yeah. And they are literally, they're ghosts of women who have died prematurely for one reason or another, and they seek to reconnect with the living world through men. I mean, it's a complicated and story. And at this stage, I feel not entirely comfortable because it defies so many ideas about reality. But in any case, for me, it altered my. And what was interesting too, there were two other people with me when I had the experience. So again, it wasn't just a one-off subjective experience but it did involve a whole night of encountering one of these entities, and for a long time trying to just come to terms with what does it mean? How is it that a physical life can end and a seeming consciousness? I mean, I'm here in Scotland now where, it's just teeming with ghosts in all of the castles and old manors but it's not something I've experienced here, but I would have to say that I did in Nepal.
It's exciting and spooky, mysterious at the same time. Yeah, there's I mean, growing up, I hear a lot of stories, female ghosts and that appear in the skies, in lakes, and they have certain cultures have different names. Some of them, they have a certain agenda with things that they have not done here on Earth. But anyways, that's one can have an entire topic. Are you ever planning to publish a lot of this findings in the future when you seem like you're ready?
I'll probably talk about some of that in the context of the Soma research will be ongoing because that sort of opened up a channel. And I just came back after our trip in Bhutan. I just came back here to Scotland a week ago because I stayed on for another 6 weeks to kind of pursue possible research angles to do with Soma and its connection with the Tantric yogas. And that led to some very interesting encounters and meetings that I definitely want to follow up on. And a lot of that really does, I hadn't made that connection before, but it does bring us into that strange interworld between naturalistic and so-called supernaturalistic phenomena. And so that may be something to look into further. And the Soma, just to go back to that for a moment, because it's not something that I addressed so much in the chapter in the book that's just come out, Expanding Mindscapes. But one of the things that I find very interesting about Soma is it wasn't just for creating, for achieving a divine consciousness in which one participated in the dimension of the gods, of the Vedic gods, but actually it was Indra who was the greatest god and consumer of Soma. He took it for invincibility on the battlefield and for power. And we sort of forget sometimes that a lot of these substances were used not just for their mental effects, but for physical healing and for resilience, or what would be called in the kind of psychedelic literature is battle trance. We think of the Vikings, the berserkers, those who ate these mushrooms, whether they were amanita or certain other forms of psilocybin, in order to gain physical capacities that go beyond what we normally think are possible. So that I find fascinating, and there was evidence again in India of some of these substances being used for healing in that sense, not just of the mind but of the body. So that's something that I find, particularly interesting, and how we can actually increase our physiological capacities rather than just our mental capacities. Sorry, the light fell down here. So yeah, that's kind of probably the next line of research that I'll do will be on. Sorry, I'll leave that on soma, on different dimensions of it and its use within different living lineages in India, particularly the Kaula and the Agori tradition. I was with an Agori yogi up in the Himalayan foothills in Bengal near Kalimpong, and who had, again, their own tradition in the Agori, their own concepts of soma, outer and internal soma, and how the outer formula, with 25 ingredients in this case, can catalyze internal states, and the way that it's ingested in conjunction with particular pranayama exercises I found very, very interesting. So yeah, so I need to go back to India, and which I'll do in the spring, and kind of pursue all of that further. And yeah, that's the next project.
Wow, wonderful.
Along with what we're doing with Vajrapath, and trying to bring some of these more esoteric practices into greater resonance with contemporary culture, and looking at ways of making accessible some of the extraordinary techniques that have been historically kept quite hidden just due to religious and cultural conventions. So as you know, with Dr. Nida, Chenangsang, as in Bhutan, and what we'll do this next summer in Tibet and Mount Kailash, and then again in Bhutan next fall, will be increasing explorations of ways in which the really deep esoteric techniques can be not just made accessible to contemporary practitioners outside of those traditional cultural contexts, but also to begin to explore, measurable outcomes of practicing those methods. And that's kind of our current thinking about how the Vajrapath, as we call it, will continue.
As they so call it, the evolution of transmission. How do you transmit? And there are new, right now you have, back in the days, one had to find a master. And, if you found a master, you're lucky. And, there's a test, there's a connection and bond and learning and challenges, etc. And, compared to that time and right now, things have changed so far. There are retreats, different gurus, different modalities. But I'm really excited about how, you and Dr. Nida are using this opportunity and teachings, trying to sort of open up the link between the modern, the city living people, normal people, and getting into this ancient practices that would aid in our spiritual process, self-development, and the likes. Yeah, I really appreciate that. And it was a pleasure talking to you. I know these topics are never ending, and you can go really deeper into many different topics and avenues. And I hope to continue this sometimes in the future. And also I hope to join you guys in the next expedition.
Great.
It was a pleasure. Is there anything else you'd like to conclude this our conversation?
Well, only just to say, that I really appreciate, what you are doing with your podcasts and bringing a lot of this material into, it's really in that sense sharing the vision that Dr. Nida and I have had with the Vajrapath, which is how do we take things that are often sort of shrouded in mystery and secrecy and show that these are really part of our collective human heritage and inheritance, and that things that we can tap into in ways sometimes that people aren't fully aware of. And I think what you're able to do through these podcasts and our conversations like this is to open up for many people avenues of exploration that I think can be really life enriching on so many levels. So I'm very grateful for to participate in your ongoing series, and especially look forward to your participation in Dr. Nita's and my explorations and the further adventures to come, east and west, as we look at these hidden dimensions of the human condition. So thank
Yeah,
you very, very much
yeah. Thank you,
for
and
all of this.
I wish you all the best in your ongoing adventures and research, and looking forward to having a continual conversations on this topic.
Great, Shamim. Thank you very, very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you. Have a
Okay,
good one. Okay. Take care.
will do. Take care.